Welcome back. There were a lot of great Kickstarter watches from last year, but I think the most successful out of all of them was the Axios Ironclad, a diver that got fully funded in under 3 minutes and raised 10 times their original goal. And I was lucky enough to check out their prototype firsthand. Well, a year later, Axios is back, and this time it's with their flagship. It was released last week, but they reached out a month ago and wanted to know if they could give me this one to review. Although this time they are doing things a little bit different, as this isn't a prototype, but the full production model. So, like their sister brand Zelos, they've decided to skip the whole Kickstarter thing and sell directly on their site. Now, like the Ironclad, the flagship is a 40mm watch with a great build quality and one that checks all the boxes on everything you would want in a great diver. But that's where the similarities stop. The Ironclad is a little thicker, as well as having 500 meters of water resistance. It's sort of a subby evolved, if you will. Where the flagship is a little thinner, has a standard 200 meters of water resistance, and is more of a vintage 60s or 70s vibe to it, reminding me more of a classic Zodiac or a Rado Captain Cook. It's really a great looking watch, and one we should take a closer look at. The flagship is listed as being 40mm wide, but it's actually a little thinner than that. At 40mm is just the bezel that sticks out slightly. The case itself is probably closer to 39, and even with the crown, it's only 43. So combine that with the shorter lug-to-lug of 46.5, and I think you have a platform that should be a great fit for most people, even if your wrist is on the slender side. Now, total thickness is about 13.2, which is a little thicker for a watch with a Miyota movement. But a bit of that is thanks to the embossed case spec and the box sapphire crystal. Without that crystal, it's more like 11.2. So part of me wants to say that they should have gone with a shorter domed crystal or ditched that embossed case spec, but they both look great. And the box crystal even lends to that vintage look. Lug width is 20mm, so you're going to have plenty of strap options out there, but I don't think you're going to need them. This Beads of Rice bracelet is really good. And the flagship on that bracelet, I think, strikes a good balance between size and comfort. With that bracelet, it's around 150 grams, so it has a good solid feel to it, but not too heavy, and one you can easily forget you're wearing. Just like the earlier Ironclad, the overall fit and finish here is great. It's mostly brushed, with a few polished sections that really help accentuate the case shape, such as a beveled edge that runs from lug to lug, and a section on the back that tapers towards the case back. The sides have a vertical brushing, and I think that draws attention and showcases the overall slender look of the case, while the top has more of a linear brushing that runs the entire length from lug to lug, and stays parallel to the beads of rice on the bracelet, which draws your eyes across the entire length, and I think helps unify the entire design. Now, I love a custom case back, and the Ironclad prototype I saw had a pretty good start, but the ship itself looked a little flat, and there was something off about the negative space that surrounded it. So I'm glad to see that Axios followed that up with another custom case back, but it's a big improvement on what I previously saw. The image here is of the HMS Victory, which I believe was Horatio Nelson's flagship during the Napoleonic Wars. So kind of a cool touch of history, and a pretty cool case back. But if I were to nitpick, I think they missed a cooler opportunity. Each colorway is named after a different ship that sailed during that era, which includes the Victory. So I think it would have been cooler if the case back of each colorway had their own ship. But to be fair, they probably look so similar you wouldn't be able to tell them apart anyways. But it still would have been cool. Anyway, let's turn the History channel off and get back to the flagship. Now, keeping with that early dive watch look, there are no crown guards here. Just a smaller, simple signed crown at the 3. With the bezel sticking slightly out, I think the crown can be a little hard when you want to start unscrewing it. But other than that, I never had a problem. And as for the bezel itself, well, this bezel is as good as it gets, and a polar opposite from the muddled one on the Orient Star I just looked at. The bezel is a little wider than you typically see on a watch of this size, not to mention pretty flat with a nice sapphire insert. But combine both of those with a nice coin edge, and you have a bezel that's always easy to get a grip on and use. And along those same lines, I think this might be the best bezel I've seen on a watch of this size, as it's 120 click, unidirectional, zero backplay, and a phenomenal action. Just nice, crisp, and clear with an audible and tactile response as you turn it. It really is a textbook example of what a bezel should be. However, it's not all unicorns and rainbows here. There are a couple of issues. With this particular colorway, the insert is a dark blue with white minute indicators, as well as a red triangle at the top. Those white markings against the blue backdrop offer a great deal of contrast and make it always easy to read. And I think the color matches the dial perfectly and looks as if it was an extension of it. However, that red triangle is a bit thin, and I think it starts to blend into the design. To the point that if you're in lower lit conditions, like say indoors or outside at dusk, it really doesn't pop out as much as the rest of the bezel, which can make it an issue if you're actually trying to time something. So maybe a little minor issue here in terms of functionality, but I think it's one you might get used to in time. And if I was to nitpick this a little further, I think there's a little bit of a clash with the bezel and the rest of the watch, as the rest of the flagship, which includes the beads of rice bracelet, have a nice curvy organic flow, whereas the bezel is the only real flat surface on the entire watch. It's just kind of this wide flat disc that sits on top. And one of the side effects of this wider bezel is that the dial isn't quite as big as it normally would be. Not a lot, it's just a little bit smaller, and I think that gives the watch a similar presence to, say, a 39 or 38mm diver. And whether or not that's a good or bad thing really depends on your own preferences. But as I said, these are nitpicks, and as a whole, I think the bezel strikes a great compromise between form and function. But regardless of all that, the dial is gorgeous. And I think it matches perfectly with the beads of rice bracelet to give you just a touch of elegance. The design language that Axios developed on the Ironclad is apparent here, namely those elongated primary indices at the 9, 12, and 3, as well as the date at the 6. But other than that, the flagship and the Ironclad have their own individual look and feel. The indices are applied wedges, with a thin polished frame filled to the brim with white lume, as well as a painted white chapter ring filling in the gaps between each index. The hour hands are sticks, and again with a thin polished frame followed by a larger white section, which mirrors those indices. And I think that polished frame on all of them can blend into the dark sunburst backdrop, but the white section contained within really stands out and makes the watch always easy to read, and that's even before the lume kicks in. Plus, I love that small red tip on the second hand. While the dial is a classic blue and white, and in some ways maybe too classic, I feel that it could use something more, and that small splash of color goes a long way. It's a classic look, but this blue version is easily the most toned down and maybe the most safe out of the entire collection. Whereas the fume dial on the Victory or the glint on the Defiance or the watermelon color scheme on this one, I think they have more than enough character to spare. Now, you'll notice that on a lot of my footage, the Axios logo at the top is a little hard to see. It just sort of blends into the dial. But in real life, it's much more noticeable. Here, that applied polished logo is simply reflecting the darkness in the room, or maybe even the darkness of the lens. And that just makes it harder to see. Although when you do notice that logo, I think it is balanced out nicely with the tiny amount of text just above the 6, as well as the framed date wheel then balances out the elongated indices and just creates a nice crosshair effect, focusing your eyes right at the center. And for bonus points, Axios did a great job using a color-matched date wheel for the date, and that just helps the whole thing blend together. Overall, the flagship is just a nice, clean, classic-looking, and excellently executed design. And as for the lume, well, the lume is great. Initially, it's nice and bright, and it's a pretty cool design. You have a lumed bezel, and mostly a green color scheme with just a touch of blue, where the blue is on the small section of the larger indices, as well as the chapter ring, creating a really cool two-tone effect. But I wish they had used blue on the second hand. I think that would have looked cooler as it sweeps around. Now, for a comparison, I put it up against the Phoebus Eagle Ray, the new Aragon, and its sister watch from Zelos, the Mako 3, as well as of course my Turtle. Overall, the flagship is pretty good. The chapter ring fades out pretty quickly, which is a little disappointing, and that's then followed by the bezel. But the rest of the watch, well, it keeps up nicely with the Mako 3, so I think it'll keep even a Lume nut happy. Now, as for the movement, we have a Miyota 9015. It's high beat, about 42-hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. And this particular one was only gaining 4 seconds a day. Now, at this price, I think a lot of people would prefer a Swiss Solida or Edda, but I think it's kind of debatable on if those are actually better or just more expensive. Honestly, I'm not really sure there's a right answer here, and I don't really want to go into this too much, but I will say that I've been pretty happy with all the 9015s I've had, and I think it has the advantage of being thinner and has a slightly longer power reserve. But it also has disadvantages too, such as unidirectional winding, and that rotor is always a little louder. Personally, the noise is never something I've ever noticed, unless I'm actually trying to hear it. But everyone's sensitivity is a little different, so just kind of be aware of that. Now, as for the bracelet, well, I think it's one of the best stock bracelets I've run across, at least in this price range. And honestly, this Beads of Rice bracelet is a breath of fresh air. I can't tell you how many divers I've seen with an oyster style. So the bracelet starts out at 20 with solid end links, and then tapers to 18 at a milled push button clasp. It's got a great finish where the edges are brushed and those beads in the middle are polished, which gives it a nice linear effect, drawing your eyes across it and up towards the watch. The clasp has a nice solid feel to it with a great action, and those solid end links fit into the case perfectly. Just like the watch itself, the bracelet is made right, and more to the point, it's extremely comfortable, as the smaller links and those fully articulating beads really just mold themselves across and down your wrist for a great fit. I've had a few nitpicks here or there, but that's about it. Axios pretty much nailed it in terms of what they were trying to do, at least with the watch itself. If anything, I think people are going to have a bigger issue with the price than the watch. Now, personally, I think the price is perfectly reasonable. Pretty fair considering what you're getting, and comparing it to other watches with a Miyota 9015 and similar build quality, like say the Zelos Mako or the EMG Nemo. But I think specifically some are going to check out the Ironclad, which is a beefier water resistance and a Solida movement for only $50 more. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with a Miyota 9015. Personally, I really like the 9015, and I especially like it when it's used to make a watch that's pretty thin. It's just that generally Solida and Eddas cost more. But with the flagship, you're also getting a box crystal, sapphire bezel, and that Beads of Rice bracelet, so I think it does balance out. Overall, the flagship is just a fantastic watch, and one that was designed and built right. It's a beautiful, clean, classic design, and one that not only strikes a perfect balance between presence and comfort, but also between elegance and tool watch goodness. So, if a particular colorway strikes your fancy, it's definitely worth checking out. But what do you think about the Axios flagship? Make sure you let me know down below. Or if you can think of another diver that does it better, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time.